On the evening of December 2nd, 1949, technicians at a chemical separations plant in the desert of southeastern Washington state switched off the air scrubbers, the filters designed to catch 90% of the radioactive iodine coming out of the exhaust stack, and for the next 7 hours, they let the wind carry everything. By dawn, on December 3rd, somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 curies of iodine, 131 had drifted across a plume 200 miles long and 40 miles wide, settling on fields and rooftops from the Columbia River Gorge to Spokane. For a sense of scale, the 3 Mile Island accident, the worst nuclear incident in American history up to that point, released roughly 15 to 24 curies. Hanford released 500 times that amount in a single night, on purpose. Nobody who lived under that plume was told it happened. Nobody would be told for nearly 40 years. They called it the Green Run. The word green had nothing to do with color. It referred to uranium fuel that hadn't been allowed to cool. Normally, irradiated fuel sat in pools for 83 to 101 days before being chemically processed, giving the short-lived and most dangerous radioactive isotopes time to decay. For this experiment, the fuel had cooled for only 16 days. It was still hot, still green, still teeming with iodine 131. A fission byproduct that, once inhaled or ingested, concentrates in the thyroid gland like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The experiment was ordered by the Air Force, which wanted to test whether its long-range detection planes could identify the radioactive signature of hastily processed plutonium, the kind the Soviets might be rushing to produce. The people living in Richland, Kennewick, Pasco, and dozens of farming communities across eastern Washington and Oregon were, in effect, the unwitting test subjects. The man who oversaw Hanford's Health Instruments Division at the time, Carl Gammertsfelder, later told the Spokane Chronicle that weather conditions were wrong for the release. The wind was blowing the plume straight down the Columbia River Valley, where it would blanket the most populated area within range. On the Columbia River, he said, it probably got as many people as it could. They went ahead anyway. That experiment was classified top secret. The records were sealed, and Hanford kept running. To understand how a thing like the Green Run could happen, how an American government facility could deliberately release hundreds of times more radiation than a nuclear accident, and then simply file the paperwork and move on, you have to go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of the nuclear age, but the beginning of the place itself. Because before the reactors, before the plutonium, before the mushroom cloud became a high school mascot, there was a small agricultural town at a bend in the Columbia River, and the people who lived there grew fruit. The town of Hanford was established in 1907 by the Hanford Irrigation and Power Company, which saw the arid steppe along the Columbia and recognized what water could do to it. Irrigation canals turned sagebrush into orchards. Farmers grew soft fruits, berries, grapes, asparagus. A railroad spur from the Chicago, Milwaukee, and St. Paul line arrived in 1913, connecting the valley to markets in Seattle and Portland. By the time the Hanford High School was built in 1916, a handsome brick structure that served as the center of community life, the Priest Rapids Valley had the self-sufficient confidence of a place that had figured out how to make the desert pay. A few miles south, the village of Richland sat at the confluence of the Yakima and Columbia rivers, home to about 247 people, according to the 1940 census, mostly dryland farmers and ranchers. Upstream, the little community of White Bluffs had its own bank, its own ferry crossing, its own cemetery with 177 graves. These were not wealthy towns. They were ordinary agricultural communities, the kind where everybody knew whose orchard was producing and whose wasn't, where the bank president and the fruit picker might sit in the same church pew. On January 16, 1943, a brigadier general named Leslie Groves approved the Hanford site for what would become the most consequential construction project of the 20th century. 2 months later, on March 6th, farm and business owners received letters from the federal government informing them that their land had been condemned. The government was taking 586 square miles, half the size of Rhode Island, for undisclosed war purposes. Residents were given 30 days to leave. Some got as few as 28. One family, the Grishams, had been farming the same land for decades. Years later, visiting the site of his family's homestead, a Grisham descendant described what he saw. "You don't see very much right now. you see a lot of cheatgrass.
Yeah.
The government didn't just take the land of the white settlers. It took sacred fishing grounds from the Wanapum people, who had lived along this stretch of the Columbia since time immemorial. The Wanapum were not formally recognized as a tribe by the federal government, which made their displacement administratively simpler and their recourse essentially non-existent, and the government took the dead. 177 bodies were disinterred from the White Bluff Cemetery and moved to Prosser, 30 miles away. The orchards were bulldozed. The farmhouses were demolished or repurposed. The Hanford High School, too substantial to knock down easily, was left standing. It still stands today, surrounded by tumbleweed, home to nesting ospreys. About 1,500 people were displaced from Hanford, White Bluffs, and the surrounding farms. Some received what they considered fair compensation. Others thought they were robbed. The nation was at war. You did what the government asked, even when the government wouldn't tell you why. What moved in behind them was staggering. Colonel Franklin T. Mathias, a 34-year-old Army engineer who had been personally tapped by General Groves, oversaw the transformation of the site. The prime contractor was DuPont, the chemical giant, which at that moment was arguably the most capable industrial engineering firm in the country. Together, they built the Hanford Engineer Works from nothing, in the desert, in secret, at a speed that still seems barely credible. During the construction period, the workforce peaked at 51,000. The Hanford Construction Camp, erected directly over the old Hanford town site, became the third largest city in the state of Washington. Workers were housed in tents at first, then in 190-person barracks, 20-person hutments and trailer parks. 8 mess halls served fresh-baked bread, pies, and balanced meals, family style. The camp had its own hospital, its own grocery store, its own recreation hall where some of the best orchestras in the country came to perform. DuPont interviewed over 225,000 candidates to fill those positions. Because the War Manpower Board dictated where companies could recruit, you couldn't poach workers from Boeing or the shipyards. A huge proportion were hired from the South, which was less industrialized. About 14% of the workers were African American men, hired mostly for low-skill construction jobs, housed in segregated barracks. Their arrival permanently changed the demographics of the Tri-Cities region. These 51,000 people built 554 buildings, 386 miles of road, 158 miles of railroad, 50 miles of power lines, 4 electrical substations, and hundreds of miles of fencing. They built 3 nuclear reactors, chemical separation plants, fuel fabrication facilities, laboratories, and 177 underground waste storage tanks. Total construction cost, $230 million, roughly $4 billion in today's dollars. The turnover was enormous. Workers arrived expecting the evergreen state, forests, rain, the Pacific Northwest of the postcards, and found themselves in a wind-blown desert where dust storms rolled through the camp so thick you couldn't see the barracks across the road. Many quit within days. New workers arrived to replace them the same week. But enough stayed, and the work proceeded at a pace that astonished even the engineers directing it. The B reactor's construction began in October 1943. It went critical 11 months later. A building that had never been attempted in the history of human engineering, designed, built, and operational in less than a year. And virtually none of the 51,000 people who built it knew what they were building. The compartmentalization was absolute. Workers were assigned tasks without context. A pipe fitter knew he was fitting pipes. He didn't know what would flow through them. An electrician wired panels. She didn't know what they controlled. Security badges were color-coded by clearance level. Posters on every wall reminded employees that careless talk could cost lives. Mail from the Richland post office was postmarked Seattle to disguise the location. Only a tiny handful of senior scientists and military officers understood the full scope. They were building the world's first industrial-scale plutonium production facility, the machine that would produce the core of the atomic bomb. Meanwhile, DuPont was simultaneously building a new city. Richland, the farming village of 247 people, was razed and reconstructed as a planned government community for Hanford's permanent white-collar workforce. By the end of 1945, its population had exploded to 15,000. The Army Corps of Engineers laid out the streets, many named after famous engineers. Houses were built in tracts, assigned by family size. singles in barracks or apartments, families in duplexes or detached homes. All land and buildings were owned by the federal government. Rent was token. Light bulbs were replaced by the government. Trees were planted in your yard by the government. Bus service was free. It was, in every sense, a company town, except the company was the United States of America. On September 26, 1944, at 10:48 in the evening, the B reactor went critical. It was the world's first full-scale plutonium production reactor, a 1,200-ton graphite cylinder penetrated by 2,004 aluminum tubes, cooled by water pumped directly from the Columbia River and returned, after passing through the reactor, directly back to the Columbia. Enrico Fermi, who had achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction in a squash court under the University of Chicago, stands 2 years earlier, personally supervised the fuel loading. Every clock on the premises was later stopped at 10:48 to mark the moment. There was a brief scare. Within hours of startup, the reactor mysteriously lost power. John Wheeler, one of the physicists on site, correctly theorized that xenon-135, a fission byproduct, was absorbing neutrons and poisoning the reaction, a problem nobody had encountered before because nobody had ever run a reactor this large. DuPont's engineers, who had prudently overbuilt the reactor with extra fuel channels beyond what the physicists said was necessary, saved the project. The additional channels compensated for the xenon poisoning. It was, in retrospect, one of the luckiest engineering decisions of the war. By November 1944, B reactor was producing plutonium. In February 1945, Army officers boarded a passenger train carrying a stainless steel flask containing 3.5 ounces of semi-liquid plutonium, the first shipment to Los Alamos, where the bomb designers were waiting. By June, Hanford had shipped enough plutonium to build 2 softball-sized cores, each weighing about 13.5 pounds. One went into the Trinity test device, detonated at Alamogordo, New Mexico, on July 16, 1945. The other became the core of Fat Man, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th. When the news broke, Richland erupted. The secret was finally out. The city immediately adopted a new slogan: Richland, the atom-bustin' village of the West. Within months, students at Columbia High School, later renamed Richland High, voted to change their mascot from the Beavers to the Bombers. A gold R over a mushroom cloud became the school's logo. It remains the logo today. Proud of the cloud is still a familiar chant at football games. The local hamburger joint sells a sandwich called the Meltdown. DuPont, having fulfilled its wartime contract, pulled out in 1946. General Electric took over operations. The Atomic Energy Commission, created by Congress in 1946 to transfer nuclear matters from military to civilian control, became Hanford's governing authority, and then the Cold War heated up and everything accelerated. When the Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb in August 1949, the American nuclear program shifted into overdrive. Hanford wasn't just maintained, it was massively expanded. New reactors were built, eventually 9 in total, lined up along the Columbia River. New chemical separation plants were constructed. The workforce grew again. Richland's population surged to 21,809 by the 1950 census, nearly twice as large as each of its neighboring cities, Kennewick and Pasco. By 1952, it peaked at around 27,000. A second construction camp, built in North Richland to house the workers building the new facilities, was described by federal officials as the largest peacetime construction project in American history up to that time. For the people of Richland, this was a golden age of a very peculiar kind. They lived in a city where the government owned everything, provided everything, and asked only one thing in return: don't ask what happens at the plant. And they didn't. These were patriotic Americans in the early Cold War. They had helped win World War II. Their work was keeping the free world safe from Soviet aggression. The nuclear mission wasn't just a job. It was a civic identity, woven into the fabric of everyday life. You worked at the plant. Your neighbor worked at the plant. Your kids played Little League with the kids of the people who worked at the plant. The high school mascot was literally a bomb. On autumn Friday nights, the bleachers at Bomber Stadium filled with families whose paychecks all came from the same source, cheering under a logo that celebrated the product their city manufactured. If a light bulb burned out in your kitchen, you called the government and they sent someone to replace it. If your lawn needed mowing, you mowed it, but the government had planted the trees. Richland was comfortable, safe, well-maintained, and entirely dependent on a single employer whose product was classified and whose waste disposal practices were secret. What almost nobody in Richland knew, what the government went to extraordinary lengths to ensure nobody would know, was that from the very first day the reactors began operating, Hanford was releasing massive quantities of radioactive material into the air and water. The numbers are difficult to absorb. In 1945 alone, Hanford's chemical separation plants released an estimated 345,000 curies of iodine-131 into the atmosphere. 345,000 curies in a single year during the same months that the residents of Richland were celebrating the end of the war and painting mushroom clouds on their gymnasium floor. Between 1944 and 1957, the total atmospheric release of iodine-131 from Hanford reached approximately 740,000 curies. To repeat the comparison, 3 Mile Island released 15 to 24 curies. Hanford released 740,000. Over 13 years, in a steady, invisible stream, drifting on the wind across eastern Washington, northeastern Oregon, northern Idaho, and into Montana and Canada. Iodine-131 has an 8-day half-life, which sounds reassuring until you understand the exposure pathway. The iodine settles on grass. Cows eat the grass. The iodine concentrates in their milk. Children drink the milk. The iodine accumulates in their thyroid glands, a small butterfly-shaped organ at the base of the throat, where it irradiates the tissue from the inside. The children who drank the most milk, especially those whose families kept backyard cows or goats, which concentrate iodine even more efficiently than commercial dairy cattle, received the highest doses. A girl in the Spokane Valley drinking a glass of milk from her family's cow in 1945 was, without knowing it, delivering radioactive material directly to the organ most vulnerable to it. Nobody warned her. Nobody warned her parents. Nobody told the dairy farmers across 3 states that their pastures were dusted with fallout from a production facility 100 miles upwind. Nobody suggested that maybe the children should drink something else for a while. The releases continued month after month, year after year, for over a decade. Hanford officials knew. They knew early, and they knew in detail. Internal studies conducted at the facility itself demonstrated exactly how iodine-131 moved through the food chain. Researchers maintained a farm near one of the reactors, a working agricultural operation inside a nuclear weapons complex, where they fed radioactive material to sheep, dogs, pigs, fish, and even alligators. Up to 1,000 animals were housed there at any given time. Studies on sheep showed that ingested iodine-131 caused virtually complete destruction of the animals' thyroid glands and those of their offspring. The researchers watched it happen, documented it, and published the results in classified reports that no one outside the security perimeter would see for 4 decades. Meanwhile, a few miles downwind, farm families were feeding their children the same kind of milk from the same kind of animals, grazing on the same kind of contaminated grass. Hanford's public relations arm assured the surrounding communities that not one atom had escaped the facility. And the air was only part of it. The reactors used Columbia River water as coolant, tens of thousands of gallons per minute, pumped through the reactor cores, where it became irradiated, and then discharged back into the river after only brief retention in holding basins. That water carried with it a cocktail of radionuclides: phosphorus-32, zinc-65, arsenic-76, neptunium-239, chromium, manganese, copper, and dozens of others. From 1951 through 1959, radioactive waste drained into the Columbia at a rate of 7,000 to 20,000 curies per day. The Columbia River, the largest river in the Pacific Northwest, the river that Lewis and Clark had followed to the ocean in 1805, the river that sustained salmon runs that fed entire civilizations for millennia, was being used simultaneously as a nuclear coolant and a waste disposal system. The same river where families downstream fished for salmon and steelhead, the same river that irrigated farmland across 2 states, the same river that supplied drinking water to towns along its banks all the way to Portland, Oregon, 200 miles downstream. Then there was the ground. The chemical separation process that extracted plutonium from irradiated uranium produced enormous volumes of liquid waste, hot, corrosive, intensely radioactive. This waste was pumped into the 177 underground storage tanks that the construction crews had built during the war. The single-shell tanks, 149 of them, were made of carbon steel and concrete, designed for a service life of about 20 years. Some held as much as 1 million gallons. By the time Hanford's production run ended, those tanks collectively held 56 million gallons of the most dangerous radioactive and chemical waste ever accumulated in one place in the Western Hemisphere. But the tanks were never the only destination for the waste. Hundreds of billions of gallons of contaminated liquid, over 400 billion gallons, by the Department of Energy's own accounting, were discharged directly into the soil through unlined trenches, cribs, and ponds. The waste seeped into the earth, migrating downward through the vadose zone toward the groundwater, which flows eventually toward the Columbia River. This was not an accident. It was policy. The people of Richland continued drinking the water. They continued fishing in the river. They continued drinking the milk. The children continued growing up in a company town where the company was poisoning them. In 1957, the federal government decided to get out of the landlord business. Richland's homes were sold to the residents who lived in them. Senior tenants in each duplex got first option to buy. The prices were modest, the terms were generous, and the buyers were delighted. It was, for many families, their first experience of home ownership. On July 15, 1958, Richland citizens voted 2,932 to 724 to incorporate as a first-class city. Previous incorporation votes had failed. Many residents actually preferred having the government handle everything, from street repairs to light bulbs. But now Richland would govern itself. It was the 11th largest city in the state. It had schools, churches, shopping centers, and a hospital, all built by the government, now transferred to private hands. Families who had lived for 15 years in government housing now held deeds to their homes, mortgages in their names, property taxes to pay. They were invested. They had equity. They had reason to believe in the future of a city built on plutonium. What the government did not transfer to the new city, along with the deeds and the utility infrastructure, was the truth about what had been coming out of those stacks and flowing into that river for the previous 15 years. The citizens of Richland bought their homes without knowing that those homes sat downwind of 740,000 curies of released iodine 131. The real estate disclosure, you might say, was incomplete. Production continued through the 1960s. Hanford eventually built 9 reactors, 5 chemical reprocessing plants, and hundreds of support buildings. The site produced nearly 2/3 of all the plutonium in the American nuclear arsenal, enough for approximately 60,000 warheads. It was, by any measure, one of the most productive industrial complexes in human history, and certainly the most consequential. Every American nuclear weapon in the Cold War stockpile contained Hanford's fingerprint, but the economics were always precarious. Hanford existed because the federal government paid for it. When priorities shifted, the money shifted with them. The N reactor, the last production reactor built at Hanford, began to cost more to operate each year than it generated in value. The nuclear accidents at 3 Mile Island in 1979 and Chernobyl in 1986 raised alarms worldwide about reactor safety. Hanford's N reactor, which shared certain design features with the Chernobyl RBMK reactor, became a political liability. It was shut down in 1987. The last reprocessing plant closed in 1990. After nearly half a century, Hanford's production mission was over. By then, the secret had already begun to unravel. In the mid-1980s, a Unitarian Universalist minister named William Huff, who happened to hold a Ph.D. in chemistry, co-founded the Hanford Education Action League in Spokane. Heal partnered with the Environmental Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and began filing Freedom of Information Act requests about radioactive waste disposal at Hanford. Simultaneously, journalists at the Spokesman Review in Spokane, particularly reporter Karen Dorn Steele, began investigating rumors that had circulated for years among eastern Washington residents: unexplained illnesses, clusters of thyroid problems, cancers that seemed too common to be coincidence. In February 1986, the Department of Energy released 19,000 pages of previously classified documents. What those pages revealed was, even by the standards of Cold War secrecy, breathtaking. The routine releases, the deliberate experiments, the green run, the scale of contamination of the Columbia River, the internal studies showing that officials knew the health risks and chose to say nothing, the assurances that not one atom had escaped, printed in press materials at the very same time that hundreds of thousands of curies were drifting over the countryside. The Spokesman Review ran the story on its front page. Readers across eastern Washington picked up the paper and learned for the first time that the facility they had been told was safe had been releasing radiation into their environment for their entire lives. The reaction was not rage, exactly. It was something quieter and more devastating. The slow recognition that the government you had trusted, the government you had worked for, the government whose houses you had raised your children in, had been lying to you about something that mattered more than anything else it could possibly lie about. It had been lying about whether the air was safe to breathe and the milk was safe to drink. People in eastern Washington began coming forward. They had stories. A woman in the Spokane Valley who had grown up drinking milk from her family's backyard cow. A man who had lived in a trailer as a child while his father built roads at Hanford in the 1940s, who drank goat's milk, the most potent carrier of radioactive iodine, and who, decades later, had 2 cancerous tumors removed from his thyroid, followed by salivary gland cancer, followed by cancer in his liver, kidneys, and spine. A woman from Kennewick with thyroid cancer. A woman from Walla Walla with thyroid cancer. Thousands of people, scattered across eastern Washington and Oregon, who had lived as children downwind of a facility that had been releasing radiation into their air, their water, and their food supply for over a decade, and who were only now, in middle age, learning that it had happened at all. They became known as the downwinders. In 1990, a $27 million government study, the Hanford Environmental Dose Reconstruction Project, concluded that the releases had put people at risk for developing thyroid disease. In 1991, attorney Tricia Pritikin, herself a downwinder who had been diagnosed with Hashimoto's thyroiditis and other conditions she attributed to childhood exposure, helped organize a mass lawsuit. Over 3,000 plaintiffs sued Hanford's former contractors, DuPont, General Electric, and others, under the Price-Anderson Nuclear Industries Indemnity Act. The litigation dragged on for 24 years. Think about that number. A lawsuit filed in 1991 was not fully resolved until 2015. People died during the litigation. One plaintiff committed suicide, leaving a note that said she couldn't wait any longer. The legal system, designed to adjudicate disputes between parties of roughly equal resources, was overwhelmed by the complexity of proving causation. That this person's thyroid cancer was caused by that facility's radiation decades ago through a chain of exposure involving wind patterns, grass, cows, and milk. In 2005, 6 bellwether cases finally went to trial in federal court in Spokane. A jury found that Hanford radiation had more likely than not caused thyroid cancer in 2 of the plaintiffs, Steve Stanton of Walla Walla and Gloria Wise of Kennewick, and awarded them a combined $545,000. $545,000, split between 2 people whose thyroid glands had been destroyed by a government facility that had known it was poisoning them and had classified the evidence. The 3 plaintiffs with non-cancerous thyroid disease received nothing. The 6th case ended in a hung jury. In an early settlement offer, the defense had put a price on the injuries: $150,000 for thyroid cancer, $40,000 for hypothyroidism, $10,000 for thyroid nodules. That was the market rate for being irradiated as a child by your own government. By the time the case finally closed, as many as 5,000 people had filed claims. Most settled for modest amounts or dropped their cases entirely. Meanwhile, the cleanup had begun, or more precisely, the attempt at cleanup had begun. In 1989, the Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Washington State Department of Ecology signed the Tri-Party Agreement, establishing a framework for remediating the Hanford site. The scale of what they were undertaking was and remains almost incomprehensible. 56 million gallons of radioactive and chemical waste in 177 underground tanks, many of them decades past their designed lifespan of 20 years. At least 68 of the single-shell tanks are assumed to have leaked at some point, releasing an estimated 1,000,000 gallons of high-level radioactive waste into the soil. 3 tanks are actively leaking right now. Tank B109, which has been seeping since at least 2021 at a rate of about 560 gallons per year. Tank T111, leaking 150 to 300 gallons per year. And Tank T101, discovered in 2024, leaking an estimated 200 gallons per year. Beneath the T-tank farm, the groundwater sits about 160 feet down. Officials estimate the leaked waste could reach it in a couple of decades. From there, it would migrate toward the Columbia River. The plan to deal with the tank waste centers on vitrification, mixing the radioactive sludge with molten glass to create solid glass logs that can theoretically be stored safely for thousands of years. Construction of the waste treatment and immobilization plant, known colloquially as the VIT plant, began in 2002. It was originally scheduled to go online in 2009. The initial cost estimate was roughly $4.3 billion. By 2016, the estimate had risen to $16.8 billion. The plant finally began processing its first waste in late 2025, 16 years behind schedule. The facility itself has now cost over $30 billion, and it is designed to treat only the low-activity portion of the waste. The high-level waste facility is still under construction. The total bill is staggering. More than $58 billion has already been spent on Hanford cleanup. The Department of Energy estimates that finishing will cost between $300 billion and $640 billion and take another 60 to 75 years. The current annual budget is approximately $3.35 billion, a record. The site employs over 13,000 cleanup workers. It is the most expensive environmental remediation project in human history, and it is roughly one-third complete. There is a particular irony in this accounting that deserves a moment's attention. The total construction cost of the Hanford Engineer Works during World War II was $230 million. Adjusted for inflation, that's perhaps $4 billion. The cost to clean up what that $230 million built will exceed $500 billion. For every dollar the government spent creating Hanford, it will spend more than $100 trying to undo the damage. That is the real price of plutonium. Richland still exists, of course. Its population today is around 60,000. The Tri-Cities area, Richland, Kennewick, and Pasco, is home to roughly 300,000 people. The economy has diversified somewhat, with wine country and Pacific Northwest National Laboratory providing alternatives to the old dependency. But cleanup remains the dominant employer. The economic lifeblood of the region is still the federal government's nuclear mission, only now the mission is to contain what the previous mission released. The B reactor was designated a National Historic Landmark in 2008. You can take a guided tour. The clocks inside still read 10:48. The Department of Energy also offers tours of the pre-Manhattan Project historic sites, the remnants of the farming communities erased to make room for the reactors. You can stand at the Hanford High School overlook across the Columbia River and see where the town of Hanford used to be. The 1916 brick schoolhouse is visible in the distance, lonely against the sky. At Richland High School, 15 miles to the south, the gym floor still bears a green R over a mushroom cloud. In 2019, a Japanese exchange student named Nonoka Koga from Fukuoka, not far from Nagasaki, arrived at the school and saw the logo everywhere. She was shocked but said nothing for months, uncertain of her English, afraid of being bullied. Near the end of the year, she made a short video for her classmates. "Should we have pride in killing innocent people?" she asked. That cloud rising from the ground is made up of what it destroyed, the city and the people. Some students and teachers told her they were proud of her for speaking up. But the logo stayed. The downwinders are aging now. Most were children in the 1940s and 1950s, which puts the survivors in their 70s, 80s, and 90s. Many have died of thyroid cancer, of other cancers, of the ordinary attritions of age compounded by decades of uncertainty. Tricia Pritikin, who grew up in Richland and was diagnosed with autoimmune thyroid disease she attributes to Hanford, spent years filing lawsuits and pushing for medical monitoring of the estimated 14,000 most highly exposed individuals. The monitoring program was never fully funded. The government, as a legal matter, has never formally admitted that Hanford's releases caused specific health effects in specific people, despite the jury verdicts, despite the settlements, despite the 740,000 curies. There is one more thing worth knowing about the night of the Green Run. The experiment was supposed to release about 4,000 curies of iodine-131. The actual release was 2 to 3 times higher, somewhere between 7,000 and 12,000 curies. The weather conditions were wrong. The plume was smaller and more concentrated than anticipated, which meant higher deposition on the ground below. Vegetation samples taken in Kennewick afterward showed iodine-131 levels 10 to hundreds of times above the permissible limit. The federal government has never disclosed who specifically ordered the experiment or who specifically authorized it to proceed despite the unfavorable weather. Those details remain classified. The Green Run was declassified in the late 1980s. The names of the people who decided to do it were not. In the years that followed the Green Run, Hanford conducted other experiments on the surrounding population, though experiment implies a degree of deliberation that may overstate the intent. It might be more accurate to say that the people of Eastern Washington were continuously, involuntarily enrolled in the largest uncontrolled radiation exposure study in American history. School children in the region recall being lined up for whole-body counterscans. Men in white coats visited schools and palpated students' throats around the thyroid gland. Families in certain neighborhoods were asked to leave urine samples on their front porches for pickup. These activities were presented as routine, as civic duty, as patriotic cooperation with the work being done at the plant. The children didn't know they were being monitored for radiation exposure. Their parents didn't know either. And here is where the story of Hanford becomes something more than a story about one contaminated site in one corner of the country, because the fundamental transaction at the heart of Hanford, the deal the government made with its own citizens, was this: trust us, don't ask questions, and we will keep you safe. The people of Richland held up their end. They didn't ask questions. They worked their shifts, raised their families, cheered for the bombers on Friday nights, and believed that the men running the plant knew what they were doing. The government did not hold up its end. It knew, from internal studies it classified, that it was releasing dangerous quantities of radiation. It knew that the exposure pathway through milk was delivering iodine directly to children's thyroid glands, and it made a calculation, not in a moment of crisis or emergency, but as a matter of sustained policy over more than a decade, that the production of plutonium was more important than the health of the people who lived nearby. The secrecy that began as a wartime necessity became, after the war, a mechanism for avoiding accountability. The classification system designed to protect national security became a tool for protecting the institution from its own citizens. 56 million gallons of radioactive waste remain in underground tanks on the Hanford site. 3 of those tanks are leaking into the earth right now. The vitrification plant, decades behind schedule and tens of billions of dollars over budget, has just begun processing its first batches of the least dangerous waste. The most dangerous waste, the high-level sludge at the bottom of the oldest tanks, has no treatment facility yet. The groundwater beneath Hanford is contaminated. The Columbia River, which still flows past the site, carries trace amounts of radioactive material downstream, past the Hanford Reach, one of the last free-flowing stretches of the Columbia, and ironically, now one of the most ecologically pristine sections of the river, a refuge for Chinook salmon, because the nuclear reservation kept developers away for 60 years. The Hanford High School still stands on the far bank, the 1916 schoolhouse where farm kids from the Priest Rapids Valley once learned arithmetic and geography. The windows are gone. The roof is sagging. Tumbleweed piles against the brick walls. If you stand at the overlook on a clear day, you can see the building across the water, and beyond it, the flat expanse of desert where the reactors stood, where 51,000 people once lived in barracks and ate in mess halls and built something they weren't allowed to understand, where 740,000 curies of iodine-131 rose from the stacks and rode the wind east across the wheat fields, where a river that had sustained life for 10,000 years was used as a coolant and a sewer, and where, beneath the surface, 56 million gallons of the 20th century's most dangerous industrial waste sit in aging steel tanks, slowly, invisibly, leaking. The cleanup is expected to continue until at least 2078. By then, the last of the downwinders will be long gone. The last of the original Hanford construction workers will be long gone. The last person who remembers what the Priest Rapids Valley looked like before the government arrived with its letters and its 30-day deadlines will be long gone. What will remain is the waste and the river and the brick schoolhouse on the far bank, the one that was there before any of it started.